Welcome. Here we are again with a new webinar. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon from wherever you are on this wonderful planet Earth. I welcome you to this webinar about Miletus. So, to begin with, to welcome you in this environment of the TMS Web Academy. This has been created with TMS Web Core. So this is a web application developed with our own tools from the ground up. Some of the features you're all seeing on the right side, the chat box. Feel free to put any message in there. We might also try to experiment with the raise hands functions. The raise hands function, you can see it on the third tab on the right side, is a possibility to raise your hand to ask a question live with audio instead of just text. So if anyone at the, let's say, towards the end of the presentation likes to enter into a conversation over audio, feel free to do so. Raise hands there. I will notice that you would like to ask a question, and I will switch on your microphone. At least I will enable your microphone. You can switch it on yourself. We will not switch it on remotely for privacy reasons, obviously. And then we can see to ask the question in audio for me and for the other people here. So let's not wait any longer and go to the content of this webinar, which is all about TMS Web Core Miletus applications. So first of all, to focus our attention, what exactly brings TMS Web Core Miletus applications? Well, it is an alternative way to create cross-platform desktop applications. And when we talk about cross-platform desktop applications, I'm referring to Win32, Win64, macOS 64, and Linux 64 desktop applications. Internally, these applications will be based on web technology. And with the way these desktop applications are packaged, there is from these web applications direct access to several operating system functionalities. And we will also cover in this webinar give an overview of the different direct access capabilities that there are offered in TMS Miletus applications. And on top of that, there is also the capability to directly access local databases, where normally in a web application, you will typically call a REST API for your database access. Here. You can avoid that, and you can actually directly access local databases. Now, you could ask the question, why exactly would one want to go this way to create a desktop application? While, of course, as a Delphi developer, we have so many possibilities, VCL applications or FireMonkey applications that are also cross-platform. And here are a list of some of the reasons why it might be convenient or just desirable for you to consider using Miletus technology for creating a cross-platform desktop application. First of all, it is, of course, an easy way to share code between web applications and desktop applications. If some of your customers prefer desktop applications and some prefer web applications, well, you can, of course, share a lot of code between a web-specific client and a desktop application. For rendering your user interface, this web technology is, of course, based on HTML5 and CSS3 to render the user interface. And that might mean that you can create more good-looking, slick-looking user interfaces, especially when you involve some graphic designer or purchase some ready-made template. You can create desktop applications with a stunning user interface. A third reason why this technology might be interesting for you is that you can already use existing and many existing web technology-based libraries. I'm talking here about JavaScript libraries for doing a lot of things that are existing, that are out there, that are in most cases free, and you can simply hook it up or embed this into your web application and easily, directly take advantage of it. Similar to a FireMonkey application, of course, when we create a cross-platform Miletus desktop application, it is, of course, just one source code base, and so that's clearly also an advantage. Another reason might be that you can mix the use of REST APIs for certain services and at the same time access a database via a local operating system or other local operating system functionalities that might not be available to a regular web application. I'm talking here about the local file system where there are still restrictions, but it could be other functionality on the operating system you want to take advantage of in your Miletus desktop client application. And finally, the last one is, of course, using local databases. So if customer has his specific database on site and not somewhere in the cloud and accessible to a REST API, these Miletus applications can directly access these databases. And there's, of course, in that case, no outside connection capabilities that is restricted and secure. That's another reason why Miletus technology might be something for you. Some of you might wonder, where is this name Miletus? Where does it come from? Well, let's clear that up for once and for all. It is inspired by a Greek philosopher and mathematician, astronomer, and this philosopher went by the name Tales of Miletus. And if we ask for a picture of Miletus, the place Miletus, the arena is one of the first things that you will see. And so you see Tales here, the picture of him, and that, let's say, minimal version of the arena refers to the location Miletus. So that's cleared up as well. Now you know what, where Miletus is coming from. If we look at the architecture of a Miletus application, well, of course, as a Delphi developer, you will want to use your favorite language, Object Pascal. And one of the first steps happening is that your code that you write in Object Pascal is translated, compiled to JavaScript, because eventually it is JavaScript that will run in some browser engine inside that Miletus desktop application. So the JavaScript is what runs in this browser that is hosted into a native application. And of course, as it is browser technology, you will use HTML5 and CSS3 to render the user interface. And then how you would access the local operating system capabilities, that is through a bridge. So there is actually a bridge within a Miletus application that enables us to call from the JavaScript in the web application to call a specific function in the native application that hosts the browser. And this way we can expose several operating system APIs to the web application running in the browser. And we do that by offering a set of classes and components to make that easy, that will under the hood use that bridge to communicate to the operating system. And this way you can take advantage of the operating system capabilities directly from your web core application. How does it then actually work? Well, I think this will work quite simple. It is integrated in the Delphi IDE. So actually it is already available now in the latest versions of WebCore. So if you install WebCore, you will see in the repository of new projects that you can create, you will discover there also the TMS Web Miletus application. So all you need to do is select that application type, and then you start developing the application, mostly like you would do for a regular web client application with TMS WebCore. But in addition here, you can use the extra Miletus classes for accessing specific operating system functionality. When you compile this application and want to run this application, the first step is, of course, that your web client application written in Object Pascal will be compiled or transpiled to JavaScript code. And then this JavaScript code is packaged actually into a native desktop application. So the result will be a Win32 or a Win64 application. So here I made that clear once more. You see in the project manager pretty much what you would see for a regular web client application. And this is the form designer for an application that you create from the Delphi IDE. And when we would run this application, you can see that this runs in a native window. It looks like a native Windows application. And here for Miletus applications, you can see that the resulting native desktop application is a single executable file. So if you simply put this executable file on a Windows 10 operating system, this is sufficient to allow you to run this desktop application. Now we are also introducing that you can create macOS desktop applications or Linux desktop applications directly from a Miletus application. And so the question here is, what is behind that? Well, on Windows, it can generate a 32-bit or a 64-bit application. And internally in that application, there is an hosted Edge Chromium, which is now the standard browser on Windows 10 operating system. Can be installed on Windows 7. That is something that one needs to do manually to install Edge Chromium in Windows 7, but in Windows 10 it's there by default. So there is no extras to install for the user if he is already using Windows 10. And that is what Miletus desktop application takes advantage of. And the same scenario applies for macOS, where the Miletus client will take advantage of the existing Safari engine that is already installed, available, and up and running in the Mac operating system. And again, the same applies for Linux, where we use the default available WebKit browser from that Linux 64-bit desktop application. Let's have a quick look before we dive into the Delphi IDE and start coding and showing several examples. Let's have a brief look at the available classes and components to enable you to access specific operating system functionality. There is the Miletus string list, and this allows you to directly read and write local text files. There is the same thing for binary files, where there is a Miletus binary data stream that allows you to directly read and write binary files. You can access with the you can interact with the operating system clipboard, the Miletus clipboard, via this component. Several shell functions are also exposed. For example, something that you typically do to show a file on the operating system and use the appropriate application associated with that file. You can open a browser, an URL with the browser, etc. Get cursor pos, that gets the cursor position on the desktop, of course, not within the browser window, but on the desktop. If there is a need to get that position, get Miletus path, that is returning the typical paths that users have in the operating system. So like in Windows, that would be the My Documents folder, the Pictures folder, the App Data folder. All these common paths can be retrieved, and you can automatically save or write, save or load files in these folders. There is drag and drop capability, so you can drag out of your Miletus application onto the desktop, or the other way around. We have open and save dialogues. So these are the native operating system open and save dialogues that you can directly invoke from a Miletus application. The operating system message box. There's also an error message box, a main menu, and a pop-up menu. So different from what you will typically use in a web client application is a menu that is rendered through HTML. When you use a Miletus main menu, you will use the operating system defined menu. And that means in Windows, the menu that sits at the top of your application window. In the Mac, that's a little bit different, where your active application menu is actually sitting at the top of your screen. And a pop-up menu is also rendered in the same way. It's the native menu. It's not an HTML rendered menu in the browser. That does not prevent you actually to use a web menu rendered with HTML. You can still use that, of course, but in some cases you might want to take advantage of the menu that users are used to with when dealing with native applications. The notification center that allows you to give these pop-ups in the bottom right corner, typically, of the operating system when there is something to notify about. And the Miletus window, we deal with it later on in the webinar. That is a component that is offered to allow you to create multi-form applications. And some final components, tray icon. You can also directly interact with the tray icon from a Miletus application. You have a file watcher, so you can monitor if files are added to some folder or if files are changed and act upon these triggers. And you can also install shortcuts. So if you operating system-wide shortcuts for triggering specific actions in your Miletus desktop application. If we talk about local database access, we have also already several components that help you accessing these databases directly. So there is a Miletus client dataset. That is the dataset component through which your DB-aware components will work with the data. The data source is the interface between them, and then we have several drivers to allow you to access specific databases. MS Access, that is a driver that is only available for Windows, obviously, but you can use the classic Microsoft Access files or databases with it. There is the MySQL driver, the SQLite one, the PostgreSQL driver, and the Microsoft SQL driver. And upcoming in the next web core version, we will introduce a driver for Interbase and for Firebird as well. And maybe some of you have experience with or have already used Electron or have already heard about Electron and used Electron. Actually, if you use an application like Visual Studio Code, realize that this is an Electron-based application. And there are several more popular applications that are using this technology. So Miletus is, in a sense, somewhat similar to Electron. And therefore, you might wonder why choose Miletus versus Electron. and I have listed here some pros and cons. So I would say the pros for Miletus are that it will generate small client applications. So it's on Windows, a single executable file. That's the minimum that you create for such a type of application. It's actually the same thing on Linux. On the Mac, it's a little bit more involved. It's a folder structure with specific Mac files that you have anyway for the minimum application that can be run on a Mac. Different from Electron is also, I think, the easier local database support. In Electron, you have to use Node.js libraries for accessing specific databases. And so if you want to use Microsoft SQL Server, you will need to use a different library with a different architecture, different approach, etc. For example, if you use the MariaDB, then you will use another library with yet another approach, API, interface, etc. And here in a Miletus application, we have unified everything actually behind the dataset interface. If you deal with that interface, it's just a matter of changing the DB driver, and you're working in a transparent way with the local database that you want to use. And third point is that Electron actually deploys a browser engine on your operating system, and that's actually what makes Electron so heavy. So that means that it deploys a couple of hundreds of files, and these files are mostly related to deploying the browser engine that runs within the Electron application. Here, a Miletus application takes advantage of the native available operating system browser. So we do not install a new browser engine. No, we just use what is already available. I see a question here. I directly pick up on it about the Postgres database. Can it be located on a different PC? Yes, it can be. It's a matter of specifying the right connection string to a database on another machine in the network, and you can access it. Still, with the Miletus pros, I would also like to add a fourth item as a pro for Miletus. That is that we have full control over the feature set and over the roadmap. Of course, Electron is an open source project with many contributors and a roadmap that is defined by the people behind Electron. Also, what features are in and what features are not in, that is all decided by the Electron people. Here we have full control. That means that if we detect from you, the user of Miletus, if we detect specific needs for specific features to expose, for example, specific operating system things, then it's just our team that goes ahead, implements it, and it will become available. That process, if it is ever possible to get that done in Electron, would at least be a longer process than we can do it ourselves. And of course, in an honest comparison, there are also cons with respect to Miletus. Well, of course, Electron has a long history. It has a proven track record. There are huge and popular applications written with Electron. Miletus, of course, is quite new, and that might come with some glitches. Our team is ready, standby to address these ASAP. But of course, the reality is that it's still a newer framework. And of course, Electron is community supported. Here, our team takes care of the support. The community will be larger, of course, than our team. So before we go to the questions and answers, before we go to demoing Miletus, I'm having a look through the questions here in the webinar. I see, is a Miletus desktop app supporting FNC styles. Yes, it can support FNC styles. Does it make sense to use it on Raspberry Pi? That is a very good question. We have not tested yet on Raspberry Pi, but I think given how Miletus is created, that there are chances that we can get this also running on a Raspberry Pi. I would say interesting suggestion and something our team will have a look at. I'm switching now to the questions tab. Does the framework allow us to build on Windows and target Mac OS or vice versa? Yes, you will see that. You can build on Windows. You do not even need a Mac to build a Miletus application for the Mac. Of course, if eventually someone will want to run your application built for Mac, you will need a Mac. But you don't need it to build one. Are you using the FPC compilers to build the native app shells? No, we are not using FPC here. When we want to access client devices like camera, microphone, are we going to deal with browser permissions similar to browsers? That will be handled by the Miletus shell application from where it will be automatically enabled to access some things like a camera. Will there be a driver for Oracle? Under consideration. For REST, will it require CORS? Yes, it is still internally running in the browser. That browser still implements CORS, so that is something, as far as I know, that cannot be avoided. DB2 support, also under consideration. You need to take into account, we add these things step by step, and everything, of course, must be tested. We must set up all these different databases, and so step by step we are adding these things. And regarding SQLite, does the SQLite engine have to be deployed to the client separately, or will it be possible to include the SQLite engine in the executable? So it is included. When you use SQLite, there are no extra deployments. So I think it's more than time to bring on the IDE and get started with creating Miletus applications. So you can see our Delphi 10.4.2 IDE. And when I create a new application, file new other, here under TMS Web, there is this option to create a new TMS Web Miletus application. So application is being created, and what we can see here is a single form application with one form added, and it has already preset some icons for the different operating systems here. That is what is preset. What I will do now is save this project, so we will be able to see what is generated when I compile and run the application. And we call it, we put this in a new folder. I take this folder, Miletus, like this. I have a different folder. Let's save the files. Okay. And what I will do is I will add a web memo. I will add a Miletus open dialog, a Miletus save dialog here, and I will add a Miletus main menu. Okay. So let's add some items to the menu. Oops. Set the caption, of course, of that menu item. And let's add an open and save item. What I will do is I will create now, I will use the Miletus open dialog and execute it. to make it some, and I will call here the Miletus save dialog and execute it. And to make it somewhat nicer, let's set the filter attributes for our properties for these dialogs, open dialog, filter, I set here text files star.txt, and I do the same thing for the save dialog star.txt. Okay, and now I will handle the event on execute. That is an event that is triggered when the user has opened the file. Now it returns the file name, and this is the local file name. Now when I want to access that local file, I will bring into the game the Miletus string list, because that string list is designed to allow directly accessing the file from the local file system. So I create that string list and I do load from file from that specific file name. And what I can do then is actually assign the lines of the memo to this string list and eventually free up this string list. So let's run this application. It is being compiled right now. We'll have a look at in a moment at what is actually created and deployed. This is something that you have to do the first time. The second time you run the application, you will not have this anymore, or you can also take care of this when installing this application. So what you see here is actually, this is the native Windows menu. And I will now pick some file. I believe there are some, okay, there are some text files in here. Let's take this code snippet. And as you can see, this has been added to the memo. And if I actually do the same thing for saving the file, so then I would add an event handler. Maybe it makes sense to client align this memo so we can see it better. And in the on execute event, I can do the same thing for saving the file. So I create a string list, a Miletus string list as well. And I will assign it to content of the memo like this. And I will then save to file and free the string list. So this is how I can save the file. So let's bring actually our Miletus notepad. That is actually what we created. So I open some file again. Okay. And suppose that here we have something to add. Let's say I just add hello world like this, and we do save. We can pick a file, new file.txt, and this file was saved. So that's how you can work with local text files. Let's have a quick look at the resulting file. This is the new file. And as you can see, this is what we edited. Let's now have a look at what was actually generated. So we go to that folder, TMS web debug, and here we can see this single executable file. So if I actually copy this file, let's copy this one and let's move it here. No, that's not a good place. I make a new folder like this. Okay, and now I can actually run this application from everywhere, just like a native application. And if I run this the second time, you can see that it immediately comes up without a dialog. And as you can see, this is a 9 megabyte file. That's, let's say, the framework. When your application grows, it's actually the content of your web application that will add it to that, let's say, minimum load of your Miletus application. All right, so let's now have a look at databases. How can we deal with databases in a Miletus application? And I will create a new application for that. Let's start a new one. I will also save it again. Okay, let's save it under projects, webinar, and let's call this folder DB, because this demo will deal with databases. And actually it will deal with the SQLite database. Okay, everything is saved, and let's add an DB grid. Here it is. Okay, and I will also add a WebDB image control. So that's an image control that is data aware, and let's add that one here. And I will also add an open dialog and a button to trigger the dialog from. Okay, so it looks almost good. Let's give this a caption open to make it clear. And let's also enable the auto size on that image. All right, so what do? We trigger the Miletus open dialog from that event. Again, it's an execute that I call. Notice that I will handle the result of that execute in the on execute, and that the reason for that is that this is an asynchronous process. So it is web technology after all. There's a lot of asynchronous things, and this is one of these consequences. So we add a web data source, a Miletus client data set, and we will add the SQLite DB driver, and it sits here. Okay, and let's hook these things up. Of course, I add the data source to the grid data source property. I do the same with the DB image control. I already know that it has a field picture, so that's why I can set it in advance. What more to do? We need to connect the data set to the DB driver, the SQLite driver, and I already know what database we will open. That's why I can tell what data to use. And here we will perform select star from books. That is what our client data set will be filled with. I believe that no, the data set obviously needs to be connected to the data source. And we are almost there. What are we going to do when we have picked the SQLite database? We will actually assign it to the DB driver. So there is the Miletus SQLite driver database, and we can set it to the file name picked. All right. When I did not forget anything, well, we can make something a little bit in the filter. database or SQLite database start.db. Okay. I can actually show this database that we will open here in this sample with the SQLite Studio so that you can have a look at it. When it's okay, it started up. So this is the database that we will open. It's a database with 3 tables, and we will actually try to get the data here from this books table. All right, so what more do I have to do? I will, of course, have to activate the data set, because that is what will trigger that the data will be visible in the DB aware controls. So I set active to true, and normally this should be sufficient to let us run this DB application. First time we run, so we have to approve that. And here we can see our application with this button to pick a file from. And I will pick, I prepared this under the DB folder. I have here the Delphi Books SQLite file. And as you can see, this is actually the DB grid with the data. And we can run it this way. Actually, I did not enable editing yet on the grid. So if I enable it, you will see that also editing will work out of the box. So I set go editing to true. Okay. And let's run this again. Okay. And let's run again. Pick the database. Here it is. And so if I pick this one and I edit it, I make Samson out of Sams, then you can see that this has been edited and has been updated in the database. One more interesting thing to note here is notice that I did not specify the Miletus main menu. And that means that I'm also compiling here in debug mode. And as I'm compiling in debug mode and do not have a main menu specified myself, this means that there will be a default menu added. And that default menu is very interesting because from here you can open up the developer tools. So you can actually debug and inspect all the elements in your application, or view the sources and actually step through your code via this way. So in debug mode, that is something that is available. Obviously, when you compile for release mode, that menu will not be available. So now I'm all the time actually creating Windows applications. So I think it's about time to have a look how we can now create macOS or Linux applications. So we go to the folder here under DB, and what I will do now in the IDE, I have several configurations. And here you can see that I have a build configuration for Win32, Win64, Linux 64, and macOS 64. So let's create a 64-bit application. I do make, and let's inspect what will be added here in this folder when this application has been created. Okay. And here we can now see the folder build Win64. And now we have our, you can see that it's somewhat bigger. We have our 64-bit Miletus application that is, of course, functional, completely the same. Now we create a Linux application. So select this target and let's build it. And let's watch what is happening here. We can see that the Linux executable will be generated here inside this folder. So these two files are the files that I can deploy, that I can do an Xcopy deployment with. So let's copy these files. I have here in the company, we have a network drive. Where is it again? Lots of folders. Okay, it was not yet hooked up. Okay, like this. And here we have a Miletus folder. I create here for the webinar and a new folder for Linux. And let's files on our network drive. And now we are going to connect to an Ubuntu machine to view what is happening. So here we have the Ubuntu machine, and I go to this network drive, and we go under Miletus, we go under webinar and Linux, and this is the application. So I can now copy this one, copy, and let's put this somewhere. Let's make it webinar. Okay, and let's paste it. Okay, so this is our application. When I now start it from the Linux machine, this is actually exactly the same application. So this triggers the native Ubuntu open dialog, and somewhere here I must have my DB file, so my SQLite file, the same one that we used for the application on Windows, and it's exactly the same behavior, the same application, and this time running under Linux. So that was Linux. And now we are going to do the same thing, but for the Mac. So let's choose our Mac target and make this application. And let's inspect what will be generated here in our folder. Go to the output folder, projects, webinar, DB, and under TMS Web, we should get, is it already done? I think I have to activate it and then make it to get the Mac version. I can see that the Mac version it's coming, it's being generated. Okay, last steps to produce that executable, and it should be ready here in this folder. So what I do now is I copy this folder and let's move it to that same network folder. Where was that one again? Too much files open, but let's navigate to it this way again. Go to Miletus webinar, and we add the folder macOS, and let's paste this folder on the network drive. And now, again with real VNC, we connect to a Mac machine. And here we are on this same network drive. And here we have the webinar folder, we have the macOS folder, and we have project 1. And what I can do is simply drag out. It's a bit slow machine. It's an older Mac Mini, this machine here. So did it already create it now? Let's try again here. Maybe it is because, yeah, I already had one from a previous. Okay, let's replace this one. No problem. So it's moving the folder from the network drive to the Mac. You can see here that the total size of the Mac application is approximately 40 megabytes. So here is that folder with my application. And here is our Miletus application running on the Mac. As you can see, it looks the same. The machine is a bit slow. As I said, the hardware is from 2012. Can you imagine? And let's see where I left our database file. I actually, well, I believe that we should have it anyway on the network drive. So here we have the SQLite database file that I select to open. Now it brings over the SQLite from the network drive, but the end result is the same. Here we have this books application running directly on the Mac. So this shows you how technically the creation and the deployment of applications can work from the Delphi IDE with a database included in your application. So now I want to touch another point, which is how are we dealing with multiple forms? There are actually two ways that you can deal with multiple forms. First of all, you can use forms that are embedded in your application. And here I can say, okay, create a new TMS web form or create a new TMS Miletus web form. A new TMS web form is a form that will open up in that same native window, that same browser native window. When I select a new TMS Miletus web form, that is a form that can pop up as a separate window out of your Miletus application. So that's a big difference. But the first example, we will start with a form that will be embedded in the window that exists for my Miletus application. So here I add a button. In the second form, I will also add something. So to make it visible, let's add web string grid just to see. And what I will also need to do is add a means to close the form again. And something I need to pay attention to, that is that I will, if I want to open it multiple times, I will need to tell it to free the form, and I create it over and over again. So I set action to free. And now to save some time, here is the code that will create the form from this button click handler. I paste this code. Notice here, well, of course, I need to add unit 2 to the users list, make that form accessible. And let's also save this first. Always a good idea to save that project. So we go to the webinar folder, and the first type of multi-form application, multi-form 1. Okay, and save everything there. Okay, that happened. Now, what are we doing? We are creating T-form2, obviously. We are just here specifying that it will be the type of the border for that form. And notice here that we have an await instruction to load that form. What actually happens here is load the form file, and this means loading the HTML that is associated with that form file. Remember, as if you are an experienced web core developer, you will know that each form has an HTML file associated with it. The same applies obviously for form 2. And when I tell it form.load, it will asynchronously, that is behavior defined by the browser. The browser really requires that this is asynchronously loaded. So we load it, and we have this await instruction to make our code look sequentially, but internally it will be asynchronously handled. If we use this await paradigm, we need to decorate this function with the async attribute to make that clear to the code, to the compiler. So let's see if I did not overlook anything, and let's try it out and see how this behaves. Okay, and there is our application with this button, and as you can see, it opens the second form. I can close it and I can open it again. But of course, this form is constrained by the main window of our Miletus application. And you can interact with that form and communicate with that form in pretty much the same way as you would do for a regular web client application. But let's move now to another step, which is to create an extra or additional or external form. And let's add this as a Miletus web form. You can already see from the border here in the designer that this is a different type of form. It is a Miletus form. A separate window will open up. So I save this again here, and let's make this multiform 2, multiform 2. All right. Let's save all the files. Okay, and just to make something visible on that second form, just that you would see that this is really the second form, we add a grid. We will also add that same, that same close button. Okay, from where we call close. Now the code will be somewhat different to invoke that second form, that Miletus window form. And I use a Miletus window for that. Also, and we have obviously a button to add. Oops. Where is this one coming from? I'm not sure. Web button, from where we will start this form. And actually, it is the Miletus window component that will help us to create that secondary window from our application. Here, I also need to add a reference to unit 2, because that unit 2 defines the class of our second form, which is form 2. And actually, I will, to show you how the communication works between two separate Miletus windows, I will add here a web list box. Okay. And I will add, that is different and special. you need to realize that technically this is running in a separate browser window. So our and two browser windows are actually isolated code spaces. So we have limited communication capabilities between the two forms. Basically, we can send messages between forms, and this is based on registering the name, unique names of the forms that enable you to communicate with this. And so what I do, I will add a second button. So the first button is the one from where I open the new Miletus window, and this one will communicate with it, and it will add item. And I perform this via the send message call. So send message will send a message with this content to the form that registered itself with the ID, my form ID. And this is what I did when the form is created. It registers itself with this specific and unique ID. And to handle that incoming message at the second form level, I have here the on-form message. And here I can do something. You see the message is a parameter of that event. And I can get the text message from there, and I will add it directly to the list box. So let's run the application to see the whole process and mechanism, how it works. So here is our application. Okay, and now when I click the open button, you can clearly see that it has opened a secondary form, and these stay open and active at the same time in this case. That is because here I called the show method. I could also have called the show model. Then of course only this form would be active and model. But as they are both open, I can communicate between these two forms. When I click here on this button, you can see that my message sent to this second form is received as it adds the items to our list box. So that is what we can do with multiple forms, separate forms in Miletus applications. And I want to finish the set of demos I had in mind for showing you in this webinar with introducing FNC. FNC is our set of components. It's meanwhile, I would say, a huge library of components of various kinds, user interface components, but there are components for accessing various cloud services, for example. There are components for working with maps, with diagrams, charts, and so on. And so I want to show you that as FNC is available and ready for use in any TMS web core application, it is also available in a Miletus application. So here I have my main form for the Miletus application. And let's add an FNC planner. I always pick the planner because I personally think that this is a very nice component that already shows a lot of capabilities and interaction. And let's also add this FNC chart here. So these two components. And let's run the application. It will be interesting to see what the size of the application will be when adding FNC components that already have quite a bit of functionality in them. So I go here, Miletus webinar, FNC, TMS web, debug, and here is the executable. So as you can see, where it's a kind of minimum 9 megabytes, we are here at 10 megabytes with already two big FNC components and the underlying FNC abstraction layer. And so all the interaction is as you expect from this FNC component. If I would generate here our application for one of these targets, it will actually look exactly the same on Linux or on a Mac machine. And that was actually the demos I had in mind to show you during this webinar. I see that some questions have queued up in the chat box. And so let's go over these questions. Let's see where I ended. A question, does it work with the REST components? Yes, all REST API components are available, are accessible. So actually any component that works in a TMS Web Core web client application, you can use that component in a Miletus application as well. So you can start multiple instances. I'm not sure what that applies to, but I see no issue with starting multiple instances. I cannot think why that would not be possible. So this is instance number 1 from our application with the FNC. And let's start a second instance. And so as you can see, it's just a Windows application. I see no reasons why you could not start multiple instances. Are INI files supported? Not directly out of the box yet to handle or deal with INI files. At this moment, you would need to use the Miletus string list that you can use to read in text files and process these, but that's a very good suggestion to have something like a Miletus INI file so that you can directly work with local INI files just like you would do in a Windows application. The execute dialog shows unknown publisher. I'm not sure, was that for the dialogues, for the open and save dialogues, or was it for another dialog? I'm not sure. Here we have not set actually anything like, we have not touched version information, application, the software vendor, all this application version information. We have not set it. If we set it, it will be included in that executable. A remark from Stefan, Miletus makes Electron obsolete, question mark. I think I have listed the pros and cons looked at from the perspective of a Delphi developer. If you ask me, being a Delphi developer, and everyone knows that I'm a passionate enthusiast about Delphi, and when given the choice to create a desktop application based on web technology, of course, I would definitely prefer Miletus over Electron, but that's of course my personal choice. What more do we have? Will Miletus get the USB HID component? Well, as I explained, any web core components that you can use in a web client application can also be used here in a Miletus application. So that applies also to the USB components, the Bluetooth components, the camera component. All these components will be available and can be used. With the two form example, what happens if you open the second form and then click the close button of the first form? I would expect that it will close the application, so with it the second form. But of course, the proof is in the pudding. So let's try that out. I have my application here. That was, I believe, the one supposed to have two forms. Okay, so this is my second form. I close this one, and as you can see, what I expected, that is that forms invoked from the main Miletus application form will close along with the others. All right, what more questions do we have? Is it possible to use a shared local database between several Miletus apps? Well, yes, that should be possible, at least if there is nothing at database level configured that you can have only one connection, for example. That's the only reason I can think of that there would be a limitation. But in normal situations, I think there will not be a limitation. Is there support for retrieving the app data folder path? Yes, that is offered. That's actually the class here. Where is it? Yeah, this get Miletus path. That is a little bit like the method that you have in Windows. Get some specific Windows path where the specifier of the path is added. And so you have the My Documents, the app data, all these typical Windows folders. And that applies also to the Mac and Linux as well. As far as, of course, these specific folder types exist on the other operating system. Okay, I see an other remark that also Roman would prefer Miletus applications with a big smile. And a remark that, yeah, Roman actually, that's an interesting remark, I think. Now our webinar focused on creating Miletus applications. But as I mentioned in the very beginning, a possible reason for using Miletus to create a desktop application is in a situation where for some customers you are asked to provide the application as a web client application. For others, they prefer to use it as a desktop application. Well, with the same code base, you could actually create different project types and choose. And so you compile it once for as a regular web client application. You compile it at another moment as a Miletus application. Maybe also at some moment as a progressive web application. So this belongs to the capabilities, and actually our colleague Roman has a big project that he has actually set up to work with one code base, and he just can select what target to produce from that code base. So that also belongs to the possibilities of using these different web core application types. So let me have a look at the question tab if there is something new here. No warning here from Windows while running an unknown application. So far, the Defender has not, Defender is running here on this Windows machine, obviously, but so far we did not have any notifications from Defender that it somehow mistrusts this application. But as we know, with these technologies, you are never sure. It also happens with the regular Delphi Win32 or Win64 application, that suddenly some antivirus tool wrongly thinks that your application is cannot be trusted. And we already had that happening. I think most Delphi developers with a large deployments will already have experienced that. So I think it cannot be avoided that maybe sometime in the future that might happen once. It's always the same. It's the matter of submitting that application to the provider of that antivirus security tool, and then the normal expected handling is that it will be approved and that they will have improved their signatures for detecting if it's a trustable or a not trustable application. A question here I see from Mehmet: will the same framework use Visual Studio version? I'm not sure how to interpret that question, but I suspect that this question is in connection with TMS Web Core running in Visual Studio Code. So at this moment, the Miletus target is not yet available in TMS Web Core for Visual Studio Code, but that's actually also something that at this very moment is being worked on here in the labs. So our first of all, we will make the version for Delphi available, and you can expect short after, you can expect also the same target, same capabilities in Visual Studio Code. That's actually what we aim for in general. That is to make feature parity between what you can do with Delphi for TMS Web Core and what you can do with Visual Studio Code. I have a look if there are new questions. Can web application also use DB driver? No. That's not possible. So a regular web client application can, of course, not use the DB driver to access a local database. That local database access is actually happening in the native application that hosts your browser web application. So that DB connection is actually happening in the native application. And that's the reason why it's possible. It's through the bridge between that native application and the web application that the data is going back and forth between the web application and via the native application to the local database. But obviously that does not apply to a web client application where there is no real native part. So you need to do it there with the functions available in the browser. And this means typically accessing a REST API via the in web technology, this is the XML HTTP request API from the browser that is used for that, but no local database access. If you would really want, let's say, no REST-based database access, then Miletus is the way to go because it offers it out of the box. All right, I see at this moment no more new questions. So okay, there is a new question here. Miletus uses the default browser on the operating system. If we need to use Web USB or Web Serial in our application, we would have to require Chrome on all operating systems. That is a good analysis. Indeed, the USB API for embedded in browsers is at this moment only available in Chrome, as far as I know. So that's obviously something not possible in Safari, for example. So that means at this moment, using it the way it is in Miletus, that will default use Safari. That USB part will not work on Safari, and that's indeed correct that in that case, it would be required to set up the application with an Edge Chromium browser on the Mac. All right. Not sure if there are any more questions. Otherwise, I, of course, would like to thank you for the time spent here, for exploring and discovering new things that we are working on. So we expect actually to have, on a relatively short term, a beta of TMS Web Core 1.8 for Delphi, that is, with everything included that we have shown here today, and that adds the main difference with what you already have in 1.7 is that in 1.7 you can use already Miletus, but limited to creating Windows applications. In 1.8 we will open the gates to create applications for Mac and Linux. And so the next thing to happen is that we create a beta and that you can start playing with it. And we, of course, look forward to all your feedback. That is very important and crucial. As I mentioned in the pros and cons, one of the pros is that we have this bridge and how it works and what APIs we expose. We have that all under control. And so obviously, if you have interesting IDs, and we already have an ID from this webinar session about INI files, for example, but if you have other interesting IDs, you know that as always, our team is listening and we are eager to add interesting functionality to this Miletus framework. So we actually look forward to your feedback and to make this better all the time. Thanks for taking the time. It was great that you spent some of your precious time. I know that this everyone has a very busy schedule and that you have taken the time to discover what we have coming. So that's very much appreciated. And we hope to see you on a next webinar. Next webinar that is already planned, scheduled, is for June 22, where we will have an overview of what is FNC for those new to FNC. What is FNC, how it is created FNC, why using FNC, where can you target FNC to, all these kind of things that's coming up in the next webinar. Meanwhile, I see already a new feature ID from Martin. Allow Miletus application to request specific browser and use the default browser. The specific browser is not installed. That is indeed, Martin, that is a good suggestion that would make it even more flexible than it is now. So we take note, and our lab will do whatever we can to also make that possible. Thanks very much, Leon, for your comment. Also, thanks, Stoll. Thanks for all your feedback, for being here. And I would say see you next time. And meanwhile, enjoy developing applications with Delphi. Enjoy the language, the frameworks, and everything the Delphi community brings. See you next time. Bye-bye.